Hello everyone. I am Mr. Dread, who has always been telling you stories. Are you ready for today's story? Let's start right now. Noah and some friends went fishing at a pond in the mountains and planned to camp there overnight. As night fell, everything was quiet. They sat around the campfire, drinking beer and chatting. The firelight illuminated everyone's face, and the atmosphere was comfortable and relaxed. Suddenly, a shrill cry for help broke the silence of the night. Help! It was a woman's voice, coming from the direction of the pond. Everyone immediately looked in the direction where the sound came from, and saw a woman struggling violently in the water, waving her hands desperately, as if she would be swallowed by the water in the next second. Riku stood up almost without thinking and wanted to rush over to save people as if by reflex. "What are you doing?" Noah beside him immediately grabbed him. His expression was abnormally serious. "Of course, to save people," Riku said anxiously, but Noah stopped him and said, "Calm down for a moment. We are so far away from there, and there is no light. We can't even see the shadows of the trees on the shore. How can you see the woman's face so clearly?" Noah's words made Riku stunned. He looked towards the center of the pond again. The woman had stopped struggling. Half of her body floated out of the water, staring straight at them. At that moment, Noah felt as if the air around him solidified instantly. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees. His breathing became heavy, and he could no longer feel the heat of the campfire. There was an indescribable fishy smell in the air, like the smell of rotten algae mixed with wet mud and rust, which stuck in the nasal cavity and lingered for a long time. Noah stared at the woman on the water, and a deep doubt emerged in his heart. The water in this pond is obviously very deep. How could she stand so steadily? And the strangest thing is that the center of the pond should be dark, but her face is clearly illuminated by a strange light. The woman's face was clearly visible, but her expression was extremely distorted, as if she was suppressing her rage. Her eyes were fixed on Noah, as if she was accusing him of something, or calling him. At the moment when Noah looked at her unconsciously, black liquid began to seep out of the woman's eyes, nose, and mouth. The liquid spread in the water like ink, dripping onto the water surface and creating ripples. Noah felt as if his whole body was frozen in an instant, so stiff that he couldn't move, and breathing became extremely difficult. He tried to look away, but found that his eyeballs seemed to be firmly sucked by some force and couldn't move at all. As time went by, his head began to ache violently, as if being hit by countless iron nails, and his consciousness gradually became blurred. Just when he was about to faint, Riku shook his shoulders violently, pulling him out of that strange, frozen state. "Hurry! Pack up! We have to go!" Riku's voice was urgent and suppressed. The two began to pack their camping stuff in a panic. In the chaos, Riku kept reminding Noah not to look towards the pond, but Noah always had an indescribable uneasiness in his heart. He always felt that behind the dark water, there was a pair of eyes staring at him motionlessly. That feeling was like a cold snake, lurking in the dark, quietly waiting for the negligence of its prey. After finally packing up, they drove down the mountain and rushed all the way to the nearest convenience store parking lot. Only then did they breathe a sigh of relief. That night, they made do in the car until dawn. On the way back the next day, the two were still discussing what happened last night with lingering fears. Riku whispered, "I don't know what it was, but it was definitely not a human. That thing was definitely dangerous. Whenever Noah thought about this incident afterwards, he felt extremely fortunate. Fortunately, Riku woke him up in time. Otherwise, if consciousness was completely taken away that night, no one knows what would happen next. From that day on, Noah shuddered every time he thought about what happened that night. He always felt that if his friend had not woken him up at that time, his consciousness would have continued to sink. The consequences would probably not be as simple as amnesia. Next, I will tell you another earlier story which happened in a summer more than 10 years ago. Hiro was still young at that time, full of vigor and vitality. Once, he and 3 of his best friends decided to go camping together. At that time, camping was not as popular as it is now, and most campsites had no managers. People usually found a place with nice scenery and set up camp casually. At that time, they had no idea about the dangers in nature. As young people, they were typical ignorance is bliss. This time, it was one of my friends who suggested, "Since we are going to camp, why not find a truly deserted place? The more exciting, the better." They acted right away. The 4 of them drove an old SUV towards the mountainous area of Nagano Prefecture. They drove upstream along a clear tributary. Outside the car window were layered mountain shadows and lush green forests. The road became narrower and narrower, and finally they drove into a wild road that no one traveled on. The further you go in, the more difficult the road becomes, bumpy, muddy, and slippery. But a few people were so excited as if they had discovered a new world. They joked and shouted at each other. Even though the car body was shaken violently again and again, they were not afraid at all. Instead, they regarded it as foreplay to an adventure. Finally, the car reached a point where it could no longer move forward. They got out of the car, found a slightly flat piece of land on the river beach nearby, and happily set up their tent. That evening, the air was cool and the sound of insects was soft. They jumped into the river to play in the water, fish, laugh and play, and were completely immersed in this isolated nature. However, they didn't know that a danger was approaching silently. After nightfall, they lit a bonfire and cooked dinner. While eating, everyone drank beer, told jokes and told funny stories, and the atmosphere was cheerful. Time passed quietly and it was completely dark. Halfway through drinking, some people couldn't resist the tiredness and went to sleep in the tent. Finally, only Hiro and another friend named Kenji were left chatting in front of the fire on the riverbank. They chatted until almost midnight, and even they couldn't hold on any longer, so they went back to their tents to rest. Hiro had just gotten into his sleeping bag and was about to close his eyes when he heard a strange sound coming from the other side of the river. He frowned, turned over and poked Kenji next to him, and asked in a low voice, "Did you hear it? It sounds like someone is talking." But Kenji was in a deep sleep and showed no reaction. He had drunk too much that night and had already fallen into a coma. Hiro had no choice but to listen carefully. The voice sounded like that of a middle-aged man, with a low and intermittent tone, floating faintly from the other side of the river, with the sound of wind penetrating the trees and drilling into the eardrum. The more he listened, the more familiar it sounded, but he couldn't make out what it was saying. An absurd but unignorable thought popped up in his mind. This place is obviously a deserted place. How could there be people? Is there an unmarked village hidden nearby? But they didn't see a decent road at all along the way. Hiro is a bold and curious person. The more he can't figure out something, the more he feels he must find out the truth. So he picked up the flashlight beside the tent and carefully went out. Walking to the river bank, he raised the flashlight and shone it onto the river surface. At that moment, the strange sound disappeared. Only the night breeze was blowing on the water, which was as calm as a mirror. The river still flows slowly, and the surface is so calm as if everything is just an illusion. Hiro stood there with a frown on his face. Just as he was wondering, a rustling sound suddenly came from the upstream, as if someone was slowly approaching on dead branches. He immediately raised his flashlight and took a few steps towards the sound. But just as he got closer, the sound seemed to be pulled away by an invisible hand and disappeared into the night in an instant. The surroundings suddenly fell into dead silence, with only the sound of his rapid breathing and sudden heartbeat. That heartbeat was not his own, but came from all around him, pounding heavily on Ye's back. In this weird and almost nerve-wracking atmosphere, a strong tinnitus suddenly sounded in his ears. The sound was as sharp as a knife scratching his skull, almost making it explode, and he instantly lost his sense of direction. Then, several desperate cries came from upstream. "Help!" The sound followed the water flow, getting closer and louder, as if someone was being dragged by the rapids. Hiro suddenly raised his flashlight and shone it into the black water upstream. He will never forget that scene. I saw several people being washed down by the rushing water. They were struggling and thrashing in the water, shouting help over and over again, and stretching their arms desperately towards the shore. At that moment, Hiro's instinct overwhelmed his fear, and he rushed to the river without thinking twice, ready to reach out and pull them out. But when those people rushed in front of him, he finally saw their faces clearly. They are all his friends. They had no expression. Their eyes were empty, and their faces were as pale as death. It's not that they look like dead people, they are just like dead people. What made him collapse the most was that the last figure coming downstream suddenly raised his head after shouting, "Run!" That's him. Yes, it was another Hiro, with the same face, hair, expression, and even the mole on his neck, shouting at him, "Run!" Hiro's brain felt like it was hit by a heavy hammer, and his whole body instantly went limp. He stumbled, his feet slipped, and his left foot stepped into the cold river water. At the moment when my foot touched the water, hiss! Everything in front of me disappeared. The water surface returned to calm. The night was peaceful, and even the tinnitus disappeared instantly, as if what he had just seen was just an illusory nightmare. Hiro was cold all over, and his back was already soaked with sweat. His first reaction was, "I can't stay here anymore. Something is wrong with this place." He turned around and ran as fast as he could towards the tent, shouting as he ran, "Get up! Run! Go!" His shouting woke up his sleeping friends. When they saw Hiro's frightened expression, although they were confused, no one asked any questions and they all followed him and ran in the direction of the parking lot. As soon as they reached the uphill intersection, they heard a roar behind them, like the sound of countless buckets tipping over at the same time. They turned around and shone the flashlight and were immediately scared to death. The river beach where the tent was located had been completely washed away by the sudden flood. The camp disappeared, the ground shredded by the rapids, leaving only a wall of muddy water roaring into the night. Several people sat slumped on the side of the ramp, unable to speak for a long time. They could only breathe heavily, their heartbeats almost jumping out of their throats. Later they learned that a group of campers were indeed washed away by a mountain torrent on that river beach a few years ago, and some of them are still missing. The boom they heard was not a monster or an illusion. It was the prelude to a flash flood. If I hadn't gone out to check, or if we had discovered it later, Hiro's voice would drop whenever he talked about that night. We might have already become corpses stuck in the cracks of the rocks. That summer, Akira was in 4th grade. Every summer, the family would spend the night at a private campground near Shido, a small campground run by a couple in their 50s. The scenery there is very beautiful, with mountains and the sea, and it is a paradise for children. Especially at night, the vending machines and old-fashioned street lamps emit warm yellow lights, which always attract groups of rhinoceros beetles and fall insects to gather together, crawling all over the surrounding tree trunks, making it like an insect paradise. If the weather is nice, it is almost the most anticipated time of the year for Akira and Ren. But that year was unusual. The frequent rains and humid weather made the rhinoceros beetles disappear en masse. There were no insects or even mosquitoes in the entire camp. Akira and Ren were extremely disappointed and spent the past few days waiting in vain with the insect cage in their arms, feeling depressed. It wasn't until the afternoon of the last day of camping that Akira's mother called them to the laundry shed far away from the camp to collect the clothes that were drying. Akira was about to leave when he saw the old man, the always smiling uncle, walking out from the dense woods behind the campsite. Akira knew that the uncle was a bug fan and had raised many rhinoceros beetles. He was moved and pulled Ren over and whispered, "There must be bugs in the forest. Let's go look for them tonight. We don't want this trip to be in vain." The two brothers hit it off and decided to explore the woods at night. Late at night, the entire camp was silent, with only the occasional chirping of cicadas in the trees and the echo of distant waves. The two men carried insect cages and flashlights and groped their way to the entrance of the mixed woods. Before they entered the woods, they saw a flickering light inside, as if someone was using a flashlight to shine in the woods. Akira muttered quietly, "Someone's looking for bugs. We can't fall behind." As he said this, he pushed aside the bushes and was about to walk inside. But Ren suddenly grabbed him and said in a trembling voice, "Turn off the lights! Quick!" Akira was stunned for a moment, then did as he was told. Ren leaned close to his ear and whispered, "Be quiet! Look, it's the old man." The two held their breath, hiding in the bushes and not daring to move, their hearts pounding. They stared at the light in the woods and saw the old man holding a flashlight and standing in front of a tree for a long time, seeming to be observing something. Under the light, something was moving slightly on the surface of the tree trunk, making a rustling sound. The uncle's back was motionless, with a flashlight in one hand and the other hand reaching towards the tree trunk. Then he turned and walked towards the next tree. The light flickered in the dense forest, and his footsteps were getting closer and closer to the bushes where the two brothers were hiding, so close that he could almost hear the crunching sound of the fallen leaves under his feet. Both of them were so nervous that they were afraid of being discovered. Akira could even feel that his own and Ren's heartbeats were like two small drums, hitting back and forth in his chest, making a bang-bang sound. They thought about running away, but the forest was dark and full of rocks and grass pits. If they fell, they would be more easily exposed. They could only stare at the uncle motionless. Just when the atmosphere was tense to the extreme, at this tense moment when people could hardly breathe, a crunching, chewing sound suddenly came from deep in the woods. In the silent night, the sound was particularly harsh, like something brittle and hard being crushed. Akira and Ren stared with bated breath, only to see the old man, who was smiling at first, shining a flashlight on the tree trunk while making strange movements with his other hand, as if he was looking for food. When he walked under the tree where the two were hiding, the light finally allowed them to see the truth. The uncle shone his flashlight on the tree trunk, found the shadow of a rhinoceros beetle, and then slapped the beetle to pieces with a snap. The next second, he picked up the insect corpse like picking up candy beans and stuffed it into his mouth without hesitation. He chewed it with a crunching sound and his cheeks bulged, looking like he was eating with relish. The scene was so weird that Akira and Ren almost suffocated. Ren finally couldn't help himself and screamed, "Ah!" The scream broke the silence of the forest and instantly alarmed the entire forest. Akira was so frightened by the shout that he pulled Ren out as fast as he could. Like hares being chased by vicious dogs, the two of them rushed back to the camp through the woods and grass. Back in the tent, they breathlessly told Akira's father everything they had seen. At first, Akira's father didn't believe them and thought they were making it up. But Akira and Ren were so excited that they told all the details clearly, without seeming to be lying. Akira's father reluctantly believed it, but from that year on, the whole family never went to the campsite again. And for some reason, the family seemed to have reached a tacit agreement. No one would mention that camping trip again. Just like that patch of mixed woods, it was completely sealed from memory from then on. It wasn't until 3 years later that Akira accidentally heard a shocking news. One day, the old man set himself on fire in the woods behind the camp. His wife subsequently suffered a mental breakdown and talked nonsense all day, saying that someone was harming them. She was eventually taken away by the police and placed under forced protection, and the once peaceful campsite was closed and never reopened. The next story takes place during Takumi's school days. That year, as a member of the Boy Scouts, he participated in the annual camping activity at Uyua Mountain. Tamatsuki Mountain, which straddles Nagano and Gifu, is one of Japan's 3 most sacred spiritual sites and has been the site of numerous legends. On the night of camping, they held a very formal bonfire party. There were more than 100 participants. The bonfire was lit on a rack about 1 meter high. The flames were blazing and illuminated the entire camp. While everyone was singing and dancing, Takumi accidentally glanced towards the woods. A man stood in the shadows over there, staring at them motionlessly. The man did not approach, nor did he speak. His eyes were cold, as if he was staring at Takumi through the fire and the crowd. At first, Takumi thought they were campers from other camps and didn't pay much attention. But soon, he heard his friends around him whispering, "Did you see that? The man behind the tree." Only then did he realize that he was not the only one who saw that person. The next day, he and several of his companions who had also noticed the man went to check it out in the direction they remembered. But when they arrived at the woods, they were all stunned. The place where the man was standing was actually a steep slope that was almost vertical. There was no place to stand behind the tree. There were only gravels and hanging soil. If he was not careful, he would fall into the valley. In other words, it was impossible for that man to stand there that night. Takumi wasn't the only one who witnessed that figure that night. Some even said that the man was wearing a military uniform from an old era, like a remnant of some kind of retired soldier. But the strangest thing is that all of them, without exception, could not remember what that person looked like. My mind seemed to be covered by a thick fog. I vaguely knew that he was looking at you, but I couldn't tell the position of his eyes, the shape of his mouth, or the outline of his nose. We looked into each other's eyes so closely and so clearly, but when I recall it now, all that remains in my mind is a silhouette in the mist. Takumi recalled, I later began to wonder if what I saw wasn't a person at all. If it was a spirit, why was it staring at us? Was it trying to convey something? Or was it just staring? Thinking back on that camping trip, he felt that there was more than one unusual thing. Some people said that they saw a giant translucent white snake at the edge of the woods that night. It meandered across the ground, but its head never appeared. There were also people who were playing in the water by the river and suddenly felt as if someone was calling him in his ear. Come here. The voice was ethereal and tempting, as if it came from deep under the water. These strange details, like independent dreams, are scattered throughout the memory of that night, and were not pieced together until many years later, becoming truths that cannot be ignored. The next story, which takes place 3 years ago, is about a man named Sora. He usually likes camping alone, especially the kind of camping that is far away from people, has no signal, and relies entirely on one's own survival. When the global pandemic broke out, many regular camping sites were forced to suspend operations. Unable to go out and socialize, he decided to go to the mountains and wilderness to find a quiet place that truly belonged to him. He chose a remote valley in Shanlin County as his destination. There were almost no people there, and a river flowed upside down from the mountains. It was called Daechuanquin, a strange name, but the environment was exceptionally quiet. On the weekend, he packed his gear and set out. When he arrived at his destination, it was a little after 1 p.m., and the sun shone through the dense branches and leaves, making the forest look as beautiful as a painting, just a little gloomy. He walked around several wet grass slopes and found a flat open space by the river. He set up a tent, lit a bonfire, made a cup of coffee, and sat in a chair, quietly enjoying the tranquility that belonged only to him. Although it was still some time before dusk, he still prepared dinner in advance, thinking of eating early and going to bed early. By 7 or 8 in the evening, everything seemed normal. The fire was warm, the music was soothing, and the beer was cold. But it didn't take long for him to realize something was wrong. First, the temperature of the air dropped suddenly, as if someone blew a breath of cold air on the back of his neck. The chill silently climbed up from the soles of his feet, through his bones, and climbed up his spine. At first he thought it was because of the large temperature change in the mountains at night, but then his fingers began to feel cold and goosebumps appeared on the skin on his back, as if an invisible hand was gently stroking every vertebra on his back. He shivered, his heart tightening. Something is wrong. Let's go in and warm up. He put out the campfire, opened the tent, and went in. But when he entered, he was stunned. The tent was wet, as if someone had just poured a basin of water over it. The sleeping bag was soaked, the floor cloth was cold and damp, and even the top of the tent was dripping. What's going on? It was clearly dry when I set it up. He frowned, turned and walked out of the tent to see if it was raining outside. As soon as he came out of the tent, at that moment, it seemed as if time stood still. He saw a dark figure standing on the river. It looked like a person, but it was not moving. The black shadow stood in the middle of the water, its body slender and motionless, slowly turning towards the direction where he was standing. Sora stood there, looking at the human-shaped shadow in the water, and suddenly felt an invisible force tightly restraining his body. His limbs seemed to be entangled in chains and he could not move. He could only breathe slightly, his eyes could still move, but he couldn't even raise his hands. He panicked. He knew that he had encountered that kind of thing. Those legendary beings that can only be avoided and never responded to. Just as he was terrified and at a loss, the black shadow began to float like fog, approaching silently on the water. It had no feet, but it floated steadily, approaching him step by step. When the black shadow floated about 1 meter in front of him, he finally saw the creepy face clearly. That was a woman. His hair was terribly long, hanging down like a black cloth, almost covering his entire face. But through the gap, he vaguely saw a pale and bluish skin, completely bloodless, as if it was a corpse that had been soaked in ice water. She said nothing, but slowly approached, hovering in front of Sora's left, as if staring at him, but without any eyeballs. Sora's heart nearly beat out of his chest. He felt like he was going to faint from fear at any moment. Just as the female ghost approached his ear, she whispered, "Help me." The voice was so soft that it was almost inaudible, but it carried a pleading tone that sent chills down one's spine. The next second, she disappeared like a shadow in the wind. Sora suddenly regained control of his body. Without time to think, he yelled, turned around and ran towards the car. He didn't even care that he had just drunk beer and started the car and wanted to escape. But in the rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of that figure. That woman appeared again. She was sticking closely behind the car, looking at him straight, chasing him all the way. Sora's hands shook, and he lost his grip on the steering wheel, and the car plunged into the drainage ditch next to him. As soon as the car stopped, the female ghost appeared outside the passenger window. She pressed against the glass, shouting, "Why don't you save me? Why don't you save me?" As she shouted, she banged on the window as if she wanted to shatter the entire car. Sora could no longer think. His brain seemed to have crashed. His vision blurred and he passed out completely. I woke up again early the next morning. He was woken up by a villager who lived in the mountains, who just looked at him indifferently and said that he had been lying in his car all night and it had fallen into a ravine. Sora told the other party about his experience last night, but the villager obviously didn't believe him and just helped him contact road rescue. With the help of the other party, he finally returned home safely. Sora has never gone camping alone since then. Whenever he thought of the scene of that night, his back still tightened and cold sweats broke out. But he could never let go of the words, "Save me." So he deliberately returned to the village near the mountain to inquire about the identity of the woman or related legends. However, the villagers' reactions left him even more confused. Some pretended to be clueless. Some changed their expression and avoided answering. Some stared at him as if he were a madman, their eyes full of vigilance. He ultimately failed to find any clues. Who is that woman and why is she on the surface of the water? And why it had to be that sentence, "Save me"? To this day, there is still no answer to all of this. Candlewell, that's the story for this issue. I am Mr. Dread, a friend who will accompany you into the night with stories. If you like today's content, don't forget to like and subscribe. Or, have you ever experienced something similar? Please leave your story in the comments section. See you in the next story.